The luxury hotel was one of those places that seemed to belong in a magazine. All gleaming glass and polished stone, it towered over the city like a monument to wealth. I'd been there once, years ago, as a guest at some wedding I barely remembered. Now I was back as part of the fire crew, staring up at the place as smoke poured from the upper floors. The call had come in just before midnight, a fire on one of the middle floors, spreading fast. The building's sprinkler system had activated, but it wasn't enough. We arrived to find guests spilling out of the lobby, some clutching suitcases, others barely dressed, their faces blank with shock. Our orders were clear: evacuate the building floor by floor. The fire had started on the 12th floor and was moving upwards, but with smoke seeping through the ventilation system, no one was safe. The lifts were out, and the stairwells were packed with people jostling to get out. It was chaos. We split into teams. My group headed for the upper floors, moving as quickly as we could up the emergency stairs. The smoke thickened as we climbed, the air growing hotter with every step. By the time we reached the 10th floor, it was hard to breathe, even with the masks. The corridors were narrow, lined with plush carpets and ornate light fixtures. The smoke was already here, curling around the walls and obscuring the gilded mirrors. We began banging on doors, directing anyone inside to the stairwell. Most were panicked, stumbling out with belongings clutched to their chests, but a few refused to leave, shouting something about valuables or pets. On the 12th floor, the heat hit us like a wall. The fire was close now, roaring somewhere beyond the thick doors at the far end of the corridor. The sprinkler system had done little to contain it. Water dripped from the ceiling, pooling on the floor, but the smoke was still everywhere, filling the air with a choking stench of burning plastic and wood. We found two guests huddled in a corner room, a man and a woman, both trembling, their faces streaked with soot. The man was clutching a suitcase, refusing to let it go. We didn't have time to argue. We hauled them to their feet and guided them to the stairs, shouting instructions they probably couldn't hear. The fire was moving faster than we'd expected. By the time we reached the 15th floor, the smoke was so dense that our torches barely cut through it. The heat was unbearable, the walls hot to the touch. We found more people on the upper floors. Some were in their rooms, others wandering the hallways in confusion. One woman was trying to carry a bird cage, the little creature inside screeching in panic. We got her to the stairs, but she wouldn't leave until she was sure the cage was coming with her. The comms crackled, barely audible over the noise. The fire was spreading faster than predicted, and we needed to move down. I turned to my partner, and we began to herd the last of the guests towards the stairwell. That's when the ceiling above us groaned, a deep metallic sound that made my stomach drop. The floor shuddered, and a section of the ceiling came crashing down, sending sparks and debris raining into the corridor. We ducked, shielding our heads as the flames surged through the gap. The stairs were chaos. People were shoving and shouting, the narrow space packed with bodies. Some tripped and fell, dragging others down with them. We tried to keep order, but there were too many, and the smoke made it impossible to see. I stayed behind, making one last sweep of the upper floors. The fire had consumed most of the 15th floor, the walls blackened and crumbling. The heat was unbearable, the air filled with the sound of crackling flames and distant groans as the building began to weaken. I reached the end of the corridor and found a single door ajar. Inside was a man, slumped in a chair, his face slack. He wasn't breathing. The room was sweltering, the fire creeping closer, but I couldn't leave him. I grabbed his arm, trying to pull him to his feet, but he was too far gone. The fire was everywhere now, the walls glowing with heat. The building trembled beneath me, and I knew I didn't have much time. I turned and ran, the heat pressing against my back, the smoke blinding me. I made it to the stairwell just as the floor above collapsed, sending a torrent of debris crashing down. The air was thick with smoke, and every breath burned, but I kept moving, stumbling down the stairs, hoping I could make it out before the building gave way. When I reached the lobby, it was chaos. People were still streaming out, their faces streaked with soot, their clothes singed. The fire was consuming the upper floors now, the windows glowing like embers. I looked around for the rest of my crew, but the lobby was too crowded, the smoke too thick. I couldn't see them. I couldn't see anyone. The heat was unrelenting. Even through the fire-resistant clothing, it felt like standing in front of an oven turned up far too high. The air itself was dry, sucking the moisture out of my mouth and throat, making every breath feel like dragging sandpaper across my lungs. The wildfire had taken on a life of its own, a roaring beast with no clear direction. The wind had shifted, trapping us in the clearing where we'd thought we'd be safe. We'd been working the line all day, digging trenches and cutting back brush to stop the spread. It was grueling work, but you got used to it after a while. What you didn't get used to was the unpredictability. One minute the fire's a kilometre away, and the next the wind changes and it's bearing down on you faster than you can think. There were 6 of us in the crew, and we'd been called to this area because the fire was supposed to be under control. The reports were wrong. By the time we realised just how wrong, the smoke was already blotting out the sun, and the crackle of burning trees was getting closer. The trucks couldn't make it to us anymore. The flames had cut off the road, leaving us with nothing but the tools in our hands and the fire shelters strapped to our backs. We found the clearing, a patch of dirt and rock where the trees had been stripped bare years ago, and dropped what little gear we could afford to lose. There wasn't time to talk or plan. We each grabbed our fire shelters, the aluminium cocoons designed to reflect heat and keep the air breathable, and set them up. I'd done it in drills before, and every time it felt straightforward, almost routine. This wasn't routine. My hands were shaking as I unfolded the shelter and crawled inside, pulling it tight around me and tucking the edges under. The noise was the worst part. The fire had a voice of its own, a roaring, cracking cacophony that made it impossible to think. Every gust of wind carried sparks and embers swirling through the air like fireflies from hell. The smoke was so thick that it pressed against the shelter, seeping in through the tiniest gaps and filling my nostrils with the acrid stench of burning wood and plastic. The heat grew more intense with every passing second. It felt like it was coming from every direction at once, pressing in, trying to force its way through the flimsy barrier of the shelter. I tried to breathe evenly, but the air was thin and every breath burned. I could hear the others moving, their shelters rustling as they adjusted positions. It was a small comfort, knowing I wasn't alone in this, but it didn't make the fear any less real. The fire was all around us, a living thing that didn't care who or what we were. Time lost meaning inside the shelter. I couldn't see anything beyond the shimmering fabric, couldn't do anything but lie there and hope that the fire would pass quickly. The noise seemed to go on forever, building and fading in waves, each one louder and more desperate than the last. Then the ground started to vibrate. At first it was faint, just a subtle tremor, but it grew stronger, shaking the earth beneath me. I didn't know what it meant, whether it was the fire itself or something else, but it made my heart pound even harder. The air inside the shelter grew hotter, and the edges of the fabric began to darken. I pressed myself closer to the ground, trying to stay as flat as possible, trying to convince myself that the shelter would hold. The noise outside changed, a sharper, more violent sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't just the fire anymore, there was something else, a new sound, low and resonant, like the earth itself was groaning in pain. I tried to block it out, to focus on my breathing, but it seeped into my head, making it impossible to think straight. The heat pressed closer, and for a moment I was sure the shelter would fail. The edges had turned black, curling slightly, and the fabric was too hot to touch. I closed my eyes, gripping the handles of the shelter as tightly as I could, and waited. When the noise began to fade, I almost didn't believe it. The fire's roar became a distant rumble, the heat easing just enough to let me breathe without choking. I stayed inside the shelter, afraid to move, afraid that it was a trick, that the fire would surge back and consume everything. Eventually, I risked a glance. The clearing was unrecognizable. The trees around us were gone, reduced to blackened stumps. The ground was scorched, still smoking in places, and the air was thick with ash. The others were emerging from their shelters, coughing and blinking against the smoke. We were alive, but the silence around us was different. It wasn't relief or triumph. It was the silence of a place that had been utterly destroyed, where nothing should have survived. As we gathered what little gear we had left and prepared to move, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The fire had passed, but it hadn't left us untouched. The clearing felt different, wrong in a way I couldn't explain. We didn't speak as we began the long walk back, the smoke still hanging in the air like a warning. We arrived at the old textile factory just past 2 a.m. The place had been abandoned for years, its windows broken out and graffiti scrawled across the walls. It should have stayed that way, but someone had bought it, started renovations, and then left half the work undone. That's the only reason there were people inside when the fire started. The flames were already pouring from the upper windows, flickering out into the night. Thick smoke billowed into the sky, dark and choking. A supervisor on site told us some workers were unaccounted for. They'd been doing something on the second and third floors, clearing out debris or storing tools. No one was sure how many were inside or where. The exterior stairwell had collapsed. We'd have to go in through the ground floor and work our way up. Inside, the factory was a warren of narrow corridors and cavernous rooms, all filled with decades of dust and debris. Smoke curled through the air, stinging my eyes and making my throat burn. We spread out, each of us taking a section to search. My partner and I headed towards the far end of the building, where the fire hadn't reached yet. The air was already hot, but the floor was solid under our boots and the walls seemed intact. Then there was a sound, a muffled crump, and the floor shuddered beneath us. Somewhere in the distance, a support beam gave way with a groan, and a rush of air sent a fresh wave of smoke into the room. That's when I noticed the smell. It was sharp, chemical, cutting through the usual stench of burning wood and fabric. We found the first of the missing workers in a storage room on the ground floor. He was slumped against the wall, coughing violently, but alive. His shirt was soaked with sweat and he could barely speak, but he managed to point upwards. His mates were still somewhere above. We led him back to the entrance where paramedics took over. By the time we got back inside, the fire had spread. Flames licked the edges of the staircase leading to the second floor, and the heat was like standing too close to an oven. We went up anyway. The stairs creaked under our boots, and I kept my eyes on the steps ahead, trying not to think about how much weight they could hold. The air was thicker here, the smoke making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. My torch picked out vague shapes. Piles of rubble, broken machinery, scorched walls. The second floor was worse. The fire had torn through one side, leaving the beams exposed and the floor warped. The smell of chemicals was stronger here, sharp enough to make my nose sting. As we moved, I noticed puddles on the floor, some kind of liquid, spreading out from barrels that had split open in the heat. One of the barrels was marked with a symbol I didn't recognize, a jagged line inside a triangle. I didn't stop to think about it. The fire was getting closer and we had to move. We found another worker in a corner of the room, lying face down. When we got closer, I realized he wasn't moving. His skin was pale and his clothes were damp with sweat. We checked for a pulse, but there was nothing. I tried not to think about how long he'd been there or how close he might have been to getting out. We kept going. The flames were louder now, crackling and popping as they ate through wood and fabric. The smell of chemicals was overpowering, mixing with the smoke to create a stench that made my stomach turn. My torch flickered as we moved, the beam cutting through the darkness in uneven bursts. That's when we heard the explosions. They weren't loud, more like a series of muffled thuds, but the effect was immediate. The floor beneath us shuddered, and a section of the ceiling collapsed, sending chunks of plaster and metal crashing to the ground. We scrambled back, barely avoiding the falling debris. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and my throat burned as I coughed. My partner pulled me to my feet, and we pressed on, moving as fast as we dared. The third floor was worse than I could have imagined. Flames had already consumed most of it, leaving only a narrow path of charred beams and crumbling concrete. The heat was unbearable, and every step felt like it might be our last. We didn't find anyone else. Whether they'd made it out or hadn't made it at all, I couldn't say. The fire was closing in, and the explosions were getting more frequent. Every burst sent fresh waves of heat and smoke through the building, making it harder to breathe. We turned back, heading for the stairs. As we reached the second floor, there was another explosion, this one louder, closer. The floor buckled beneath us, and my partner shouted something I couldn't hear over the roar of the fire. I lost my footing and hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of me. When I looked up, my partner was gone. The floor between us had collapsed, leaving a gaping hole. I shouted, but there was no answer. The heat was unbearable now, the flames closing in from all sides. I turned and ran, my torch flickering in the smoke. The corridors seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways I didn't recognize. When I reached the ground floor, the exit was gone. The place where the doors had been was now a wall of fire and rubble. I turned, looking for another way out, but the building was a maze, the smoke too thick to see more than a few feet ahead. I kept moving, the fire roaring around me, the smell of chemicals filling my lungs. The walls seemed to close in, and the floor shifted under my boots. I couldn't tell if I was moving forward or just going in circles. Then the torch flickered again and went out. It was just past midnight when the call came in. A fire in one of the high-rise developments on the edge of the city. Unfinished, half the floors still skeletons of steel beams and plywood. It was the kind of place that always gave me the creeps. Too many nooks and crannies for accidents or something worse. When we pulled up, the fire was already chewing through the upper floors. Bright orange tongues licking out of windows where glass hadn't even been installed yet. Smoke curled up into the sky, choking out the stars. Workers were shouting, pointing to the upper levels where their mates were still trapped. The lifts were dead, of course, no power. That left the stairs. A few of us grabbed our gear and headed in, the sound of our boots on the concrete echoing in the cavernous ground floor. It wasn't much better inside. Smoke hung in the air, stinging the eyes and catching in the throat. The heat wasn't unbearable yet, but it was there, radiating from above like an invisible weight pressing down. The stairs to the first few floors were fine, but by the time we reached the 10th, they'd partially collapsed. Steel rebar stuck out at odd angles, the concrete edges jagged and crumbling. We had to climb over the debris, careful not to lose our footing. Above us the fire crackled, muffled but alive, a constant reminder of the clock ticking down. The hallways were worse. Smoke filled every corner, cutting visibility to almost nothing. Our torches barely penetrated the gloom, lighting up small patches of warped drywall and makeshift scaffolding. The air was thick with the smell of burning insulation and scorched metal. Every step felt uncertain, the floors creaking beneath us. We split up to cover more ground. I stuck with Murphy, one of the newer lads, while the others pushed further up. We found the first worker on the 14th floor. He was slumped against a wall, his shirt soaked through with sweat and his face grey. We got him onto his feet and started guiding him back, the path we'd just come from already feeling unfamiliar in the smoke. That was when the floor beneath us groaned. It was faint at first, just a vibration underfoot, but then it gave a sudden shudder. Dust and plaster rained down from above, and Murphy shouted something, though I couldn't make out the words. We barely made it to the stairs before part of the hallway collapsed behind us, taking the route we'd come with it. The worker was coughing violently, barely able to stand, so we left him in the stairwell and pressed on. The radio crackled with reports of more people trapped higher up, and the fire was spreading faster than we could move. By the time we reached the 16th floor, the heat was punishing. The walls here weren't finished, just wooden frames lined with insulation that was now blackened and smoking. The smell was worse too, acrid and chemical, the kind that sticks in your nose long after you've left. The second worker we found was curled up in a corner of what would have been an office. She wasn't moving much, but she was alive. We carried her back to the stairwell, navigating through the maze of hallways that seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. That's when the lights flickered. For a moment, the space around us was illuminated, a brief, harsh clarity, and I realized how bad the fire had gutted the place. Beams were sagging, wires hung loose from the ceilings, and parts of the floor looked ready to give way. Then the lights died again, leaving us in darkness except for the pale beams of our torches. Murphy and I pressed on, but something about the building felt different. The sounds had changed. It wasn't just the fire or the groaning of the structure, there was something else. Faint and distant, but there, a kind of noise that didn't belong. We found another worker near the 17th floor, lying face down in the middle of a hallway. As we got closer, something about the way he was positioned made my stomach churn. It was almost as if he'd been placed there, arms outstretched as though reaching for something. Murphy hesitated, and I had to nudge him to keep moving. We got the man onto his feet, though he didn't seem fully conscious. His breathing was shallow, and his skin felt too cold for someone in the middle of a blaze like this. We started leading him back, but the way we came no longer seemed right. The halls twisted in ways that didn't make sense, leading us in circles. Smoke blurred the walls, making it hard to tell where we'd been. At one point, I turned to check on Murphy and realized he wasn't behind me anymore. The worker was gone too. I stood there for a moment, torchlight darting across the empty hall, but the smoke swallowed the beam almost immediately. I called out, but my voice sounded wrong, small and muffled, like the building itself was absorbing the sound. The floor shifted underfoot again, a deep vibration that made the walls tremble. I started moving, not sure if I was going the right way or if there even was a right way anymore. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, the smoke growing thicker with every step. I passed a room I didn't recognize. Its door, half hanging from the frame. Inside, the walls were blackened, and something metallic glinted in the torchlight. It looked like tools, hammers, saws, things you'd expect on a construction site, but they were arranged oddly, placed in patterns that didn't make sense. The air felt different here. It wasn't just the heat or the smoke. There was a kind of stillness, as if the fire had forgotten this place. I didn't stay long. By the time I reached the stairwell again, it was empty. No Murphy, no workers, no sign of anyone else. The fire roared above me, and the building groaned like a dying animal. I started down, every step feeling like it might be the last solid ground beneath me. The stairwell was darker than I remembered, the smoke thicker, the air colder. The fire above seemed distant now, but the silence was worse. When I reached the ground floor, the exit was gone. Where the doors had been was just a wall, seamless and unbroken. I turned, the beam of my torch flickering, and saw the hallway stretching out before me. It shouldn't have been there. It shouldn't have been there at all. We had been stretched thin for weeks. The city was gripped by fear after a series of fires swept through its quieter neighborhoods, turning homes and businesses into charred skeletons. People whispered about a serial arsonist, someone with a vendetta or a fascination too twisted to fathom. For us on the fire crew, it was a nightmare. Every call felt like running into the jaws of a beast that only grew hungrier. When Daniels joined the team, no one thought much of it. We needed the extra hands, and he came with decent credentials, previously stationed up north, plenty of experience. He didn't stand out much, tall, lean, with a sort of blankness in his expression that could have been nerves or just exhaustion. We were all exhausted after all. The first fire he responded to with us was a warehouse on the edge of town. The flames were already leaping high into the night by the time we arrived, feeding on years of dry wood and forgotten junk. It was the kind of blaze you don't bother fighting head-on. You focus on containment, on saving what's nearby, and hope no one's inside. Daniels moved with purpose, keeping pace with the rest of us, and for a while it felt like we had things under control. Then the wind shifted. Sparks flew further than they should have, igniting patches of dry grass and old tires stacked in a lot next door. Before we knew it, the fire had doubled in size. It wasn't uncommon. Fires have a way of finding opportunities, but something about the way it spread that night stuck with me. It felt too sudden, too precise, as if the flames had a mind of their own. Over the next few weeks, more fires came, each one worse than the last. An abandoned school, a block of flats undergoing renovations, even a car park packed with vehicles. Each time we'd arrive thinking we had a chance, and each time the fire would seem to surge beyond our grasp, roaring higher, consuming more. And each time Daniels was there in the thick of it. The rest of the crew started to talk. It was subtle at first, a comment here, a sideways glance there. Someone mentioned how Daniels always seemed to be in just the right spot to see the flames spread. Another pointed out how his reports always had a strange clarity to them, as if he'd seen things unfold before they happened. It was probably just paranoia. We were tired, stressed, and looking for something or someone to blame. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. I started paying attention, not just to the fires, but to Daniels himself. There was something about the way he moved, the way his eyes locked onto the flames, as if he wasn't just trying to control them, but studying them, admiring them even. One night, after a particularly brutal fire at a furniture factory, I decided to follow him. It wasn't planned, I just couldn't let it go. We'd wrapped up late, and Daniels had hung back, saying he needed to check some gear. I watched from a distance as he walked away from the station, his steps quick and purposeful. He led me to an industrial area near the river, a stretch of warehouses and storage units. It was quiet, the air cool and damp, a sharp contrast to the heat we'd faced earlier. I kept my distance, staying out of sight, as Daniels stopped near one of the larger buildings. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the structure, and then I saw him pull something from his pocket. It was a lighter. He flicked it once, then again, the small flame illuminating his face for a brief second. He didn't move, just stood there, holding the lighter in front of him. I thought maybe he was just thinking, maybe he needed a moment to clear his head. But then he stepped closer to the building, crouched near a pile of discarded pallets, and let the flame catch. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to do something, to call out, to stop him, but I couldn't move. I could only watch as the fire spread, small at first, but growing rapidly, climbing the wooden pallets, licking at the sides of the warehouse. Daniels didn't move away. He stood there, staring into the growing blaze, his face lit by the flickering light. When the fire was fully alive, he finally stepped back. His expression was calm, almost serene, and for a moment I thought he might walk away. But then he did something that sent a chill through me. He turned and looked in my direction. I was sure he couldn't see me. I was hidden in the shadows. But the way his gaze lingered made my stomach knot. Without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving the fire to rage behind him. I didn't report it. I don't know why. Maybe I was scared. Maybe I thought no one would believe me. The next morning, the news was full of reports about the warehouse fire. No one was hurt, but the building was a total loss. Daniels didn't mention it, and neither did I. The fires continued, each one worse than the last, and Daniels was always there, calm and collected, guiding us through the chaos. I stopped following him after that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew I'd been there, that he was waiting for me to say something. Then, one night, the call came in, a fire at an old theatre downtown. It was one of those buildings that had stood for a century, full of history and stories. By the time we arrived, the flames were already tearing through it. Daniels was the first to step inside, leading the charge. I hesitated before following. For the first time, I wasn't sure if we were there to fight the fire or to feed it. The fire was relentless, an ever-moving line of destruction sweeping across the valley. Smoke filled the air, darkening the sky, blotting out the sun like an ominous omen. I'd been with my crew earlier in the day, fighting to push back the flames, but somewhere along the ridgeline we got separated. It wasn't panic that set in, not exactly, but there was a gnawing in the pit of my stomach. Alone in the wilderness, surrounded by fire, I trudged forward with only the vaguest sense of direction. The ground was scorched, a patchwork of blackened earth and smouldering debris. The heat was punishing, pressing against my gear like an invisible hand, making every breath a struggle. I scanned the horizon, hoping for a sign of my crew, a flashing light, the distinct crackle of their radios, but there was nothing. Just the distant roar of the inferno and the groan of the forest as it succumbed to the flames. I stumbled across a narrow trail, one I didn't remember seeing on the map. It led downhill, away from the worst of the fire. With no other options, I followed it, stepping carefully over fallen branches and dodging patches of embers still glowing with heat. The trail curved sharply, and that's when I saw it, a shelter. It was small and squat, made of corrugated metal and half buried in the hillside. It looked like it had been there for decades. The exterior was blackened, warped by heat and flames, but it still stood, defiant against the devastation around it. Relief washed over me. Shelters like this were meant to withstand anything, fire, storms, whatever nature threw at them. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The door was ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges. Inside it was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the smouldering world outside. The air was cooler, though, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe. There were people inside, at least a dozen, maybe more, huddled together in the cramped space. Their faces were pale, smeared with soot, and their clothes were ragged, singed at the edges. They didn't move much, just sat there in silence, staring ahead. I felt a wave of relief. I wasn't alone anymore. I stepped inside, letting the door creak shut behind me. The noise seemed to echo unnaturally in the confined space, louder than it should have been. The people didn't react to my presence. It was strange, but I didn't dwell on it. I was exhausted, my muscles aching from hours of battling the fire, and the cool air in the shelter was a small blessing. As I looked around, my eyes adjusted to the dimness, and I noticed things that didn't make sense. There were old fire helmets on the floor, the kind you'd see in photos from decades ago. A cracked radio sat on a shelf, its dials charred, the plastic melted. The smell was peculiar, not just smoke, but something older, mustier, like decay. I tried to focus on the people, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but there was something about them that made me uneasy. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes glassy, almost too still. I thought about asking if they were okay, but the words stuck in my throat. The air in the shelter felt colder now, biting against my skin, and I realized none of them were breathing. That was when the sense of dread truly settled in. I stepped back, my boots crunching on something brittle. I glanced down and saw a photograph, its edges curled and burnt. It showed a group of firefighters standing in front of a station. They were smiling, arms slung over each other's shoulders. Their uniforms looked like the ones I'd seen on the floor, and their faces, faintly familiar, matched the people in the shelter. A flicker of light drew my gaze to the far corner of the room. There, barely visible in the gloom, was a door I hadn't noticed before. It was cracked open, revealing only darkness beyond. Something about it filled me with an instinctual need to leave. I turned back toward the entrance, but it wasn't there anymore. The wall where it had been was seamless, as if no door had ever existed. The fire outside seemed farther away, its noise dampened by the shelter's walls, yet the silence inside was worse. It was too quiet, the kind that presses on your ears, making them ring. I backed away from the group, towards the corner, furthest from the dark doorway. My fingers brushed against the wall, and it felt wrong. Not metal, but something softer, warmer. I jerked my hand back. The people in the room began to shift, their heads turning in unison. They looked at me now, their glassy eyes filled with something that wasn't recognition or relief. It was emptiness, and yet it felt like they could see me, through me. My breath came faster, echoing in the silence. I don't remember making the decision to move, but I bolted for the dark doorway, reasoning that whatever was beyond it couldn't be worse than the shelter. The blackness swallowed me whole, and as I ran, I could feel the floor beneath me change. It wasn't solid anymore. It was soft, almost spongy, and there was a faint squelching with every step. The sound behind me grew, not voices exactly, but something that filled the space where voices should have been. It chased me through the darkness, and no matter how far I ran, there was no end to the tunnel. My flashlight flickered, its beam weak and trembling, casting fleeting glimpses of the walls. They weren't metal anymore, they were something else. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the ground. The air was suffocating now, thick with the stench of smoke and something fouler, something ancient. I lay there listening to the silence, knowing I wasn't alone.